Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week, we've been looking at process theology and process philosophy, looking at ways that this impacts liberal religion in general, Unitarian Universalism specifically, and the interface between that and humanism. We've been talking about the central book in this particular way of thinking, Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. I have mentioned before that it is a fairly unreadable book. So I don't encourage people to read it unless you're very into this, but there are lots and lots of scholars and theologians who have read the book, think they understand it in some way, that's always debatable, and then drawn some conclusions from it. It was published in 1929 based on lectures that Whitehead gave in Harvard after he came here from the United Kingdom. And Charles Hartshorne was Whitehead's graduate student, and of course Whitehead becomes his mentor, but then Hartshorne takes this idea and goes in a very different direction, introducing it into theology. And again, it's quite debatable whether or not Whitehead's ideas and Hartshorne's ideas are really in the same ballpark, but that's all part of the fun of process philosophy and theology. Now, yesterday, we looked at a proof of God that Charles Hartshorne undertook based on Anselm's proof of God called the ontological argument. Anselm, Saint Anselm of Canterbury, lived from 1033 to 1109. A very brief, this is skipping some points if you saw this yesterday, but just to give you the broad outlines of this argument. God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. All right, that's a definition of God within this ontological, this argument from being. It is greater to exist in reality than merely as an idea. All right, just an idea is just an idea, but it's greater to exist. If God does not exist, we can conceive of an even greater being, that is, one that does exist. So that would violate proposition one, that God is the being which has no greater. Therefore, God must indeed exist in reality. As we discussed yesterday, there are some rather difficult things about this proof. One of the interesting things is that a contemporary, Janilo of Marmoutier, in the 1100s, offered a counter argument. Now, we think of the Middle Ages as being a time when nobody disagreed with anybody in the church, but this is really not the case, as exposed by this very famous argument. So he said this: the lost island is that island than which no greater can be conceived. All right. It is greater to exist in reality than merely as an idea. Okay. If the lost island does not exist, one can conceive of an even greater island that is one that does exist, and therefore the lost island exists in reality. Now, we mentioned Bertrand Russell's teapot when we were talking about faux religions and those kinds of ideas. And so this is very much like Bertrand Russell's teapot, that you can't see it, but I say it's there, therefore. The problem with these kind of arguments is that from Anselm's point of view would be that, wait a minute, but God does exist and the lost island doesn't exist. So you're trying to prove something that doesn't exist, and we know it doesn't. Again, a very debatable place to be when you start talking about this. But the fact is, it all comes down to Schleiermacher, as I mentioned yesterday, who lived from 1768 to 1834. His great book on religion was published in 1799. He said all religious feelings are supernatural, for they are religious only insofar as they are produced directly by the universe. Whether they are religious in oneself, each person must judge best. His argument is that all religious feelings are completely subjective. That is pretty well where liberal religion has gone over the last years. But Schleiermacher, you feel it or you don't, is basically the idea here. It's all subjective. But reason and logic cannot establish particular sorts of gods or establish foundations for particular types of religion. So this idea has been around for a very long time. But wait, I want my religion to be true and provable, says the startled emoji. How can I have a religion that is both true and provable? And, well, the answer is that's not real likely, as a matter of fact, unless you want to become a religious naturalist or a humanist, in which we say that material reality is the only thing we're really going to talk about. There you have it. But that's not going to stop others from trying. All things, says Charles Hartshorne about this, in all their aspects consist exclusively of souls. That is, of various kinds of subjects or units of experience, of experiencing with their qualifications, relations, and groupings or communities. So if we can't prove that God exists by the ontological argument, which seems to be the last one that is even remotely possible, Hartshorne is going to take a fallback position that all things have some kind of consciousness in them. And that then feeds back into not only metaphysics, but also very philosophical ideas. Leibniz published a book called Monadology back in 1714, in which he talks about monads. Monads nowadays we would call atoms. So that term was around when Leibniz was alive, but it went all the way back to the Greeks with Democritus. So he decided to use monad instead. But the real question for Leibniz is, do atoms have feelings, emotions, desires, and consciousness? And Leibniz said, heck yes, they do. That's where this very philosophical idea feeds right back into an old idea called panpsychism. One of the major proponents of panpsychism was John Ellis MacTaggart, an English idealist metaphysician at Oxford, who was one of the teachers for Bertrand Russell. Not much known today. Back in his day, he was quite the curmudgeon. He also proved that time doesn't exist. If you want to read that logical argument about why time doesn't exist, well, go for it. It's kind of interesting, but unfortunately, sort of like the ontological argument for God, a little bit debatable as you go on. But MacTaggart said this: religion may best be described as an emotion resting on a conviction of a harmony between ourselves and the universe at large. So you see how he's going to use sort of wiggle terms here, weasel words you might call them, to get at why he was a religious person. But let us look at panpsychism for a moment. You can take a peek at this picture here, and you will see Whitehead on the left, and on the right, Henri Bergson, who we'll get back to in a moment. And you can probably recognize the little graph between them. That is the concept of relativity from Einstein. And of course, they're writing at the time when Einstein's ideas are new, and everyone is trying to wrestle with the philosophical and mathematical implications of what it meant. This is from the Oxford Bibliography. It says, broadly speaking, panpsychism is the view that everything has a mind, or at least some mind-like quality or aspect. Such a definition is naturally open to a wide variety of interpretations, owing, if nothing else, to the ambiguity involved in such terms as everything and mind. We've run into that problem before, too. If you get to define these things all by yourself, then usually you can prove them. Well, it goes on to say the word dates back to the late 1500s, derived from pan, meaning all, and psyche, which in Greek meant mind or soul. But the concept itself is much older, being found in the indigenous animism of most ancient societies. In a sense, then, we have never been without panpsychism. It has a long and noble philosophical legacy in both Western and Eastern civilizations. It really is probably the oldest human idea about how the world works. But wait, do the bananas that I have for breakfast actually have a consciousness? That's a good question. Well, Oxford Bibliographies goes on to say this: having been subsumed for much of the 20th century by a dominant analytical philosophy, panpsychism is currently experiencing something of a revival and is once again the subject of serious philosophical debate. Its strength largely derives from the implausibility of the emergence of mind from a non-mental reality and from the various problems with conventional materialism, although a number of other arguments have been advanced in its favor. And yes, there are lots and lots of books coming out at the moment on panpsychism that you can read up on this particular idea. But you see what's happening here. Where does consciousness come from if all material things are not in some way conscious, is a question, and it's a fairly good question that we really don't know the answer to. Sorry about that. So the question that panpsychism answers is, where does consciousness come from? Where does it come from? Well, and we're going to take a look now at Henri Bergson, 1859 to 1941. His most famous book is Creative Evolution. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not in science, right after this particular book was written. He has three central ideas. One is duration. That is what time is. And again, as we were talking about with McTaggart, this was a very alive question in the early 20th century because of Einstein's new theories. He also has goes to town on the idea of intuition and what it means, basically creativity. And then his most famous, which is usually not translated, Elan Vital. That is the spirit of uplift that we're going to use in order to explore reality and be creative in the world. So Henri Bergson, very famous in the early 20th century, kind of fallen out of favor now. But when you talk about panpsychism, his ideas will always come up. His most famous quote, and I'm sure you've run into it, is the eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. This appears to be a kind of postmodern statement about how we explore reality and find reality, and it's often quoted. He also said, for a conscious being, to exist is to change. To change is to mature. To mature is to go on creating oneself endlessly. And there you go. That's a central process idea. If you're a conscious being, you have to change in order to exist and exist in order to change. And as you change, you create yourself endlessly. So this idea of endless creativity through intuition of reality. He also said this: the pure present is an ungraspable advance of the past, devouring the future. In truth, all sensation is already memory. This may be scientifically true. As a matter of fact, it still is one of those debatable things that we don't really know. But the pure present is an ungraspable advance of the past, devouring the future. In truth, all sensation is already memory. Yes, he was getting that from his readings of Buddhism that were coming into the France of his particular day. Very, very Buddhist idea. One last foot from him: it is astonishing that, like children trying to catch smoke by closing their hands, philosophers so often see the object they would grasp fly before them. So we can't get at reality. So what we need to do instead is think through Elan Vital, through the spirit into a creative mode of being. That's the idea anyway. So there we have a bunch of ideas that are fitting together. If we can't prove the existence of God, maybe we're going to back up a little bit and go to some other ideas that we haven't yet solved through science or through logic, and see if those can get us back to some kind of idea of a soul and a supernatural effect in the world. And again, debatable, but highly possible. We just don't know. Tomorrow, I'll end up by reviewing and also talking a little bit more about one of Hartshorne's major ideas, panentheism, the other God of the philosophers. And as this book says, from Plato to the present, Hartshorne dug back through a philosophical thinking to find what he saw as the step beyond pantheism and panpsychism into panentheism, the idea that all of the parts end up being a whole lot more than the parts. The whole is bigger than the parts. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. As we look back this month, our theme is commitment. And this Sunday, I'll be talking about the 10 commitments, or how can I help? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from an idea from the American Humanist Association, going with the 10 commitments of humanism. And that's what I'll be talking about on Sunday. So thanks a lot for joining us today. I'll see you tomorrow with a kind of wrap up of what process philosophy and theology is, or I'll see you Sunday. Thanks a lot.